antediluvian world, the Nephilim. I believe they governed the earth. And the Watchers, by the way, were exercising what I describe in my book Birthright as rule by proxy. It was proximal authority through the agency of their hybrid sons. Because
a man stands over a newborn child and feels terror. Not wonder, not relief, terror. The child is wrapped and breathing. The birth is over. The mother is alive. By every measure known to the ancient world, this is a moment of celebration, but Lamech cannot stop shaking. This is not a myth. This is not invented drama. This is preserved in an ancient Aramaic manuscript discovered in Cave 1 at Qumran in 1947, a text scholars call the Genesis Apocryphon, one of the original Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to somewhere between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, copying traditions far older than the scroll itself. The scroll is damaged. Pieces are missing. But what survives is enough to stop a reader cold. The child Lamech is looking at his Noah, and Lamech does not believe the child is his. Hi viewers, here is a question that needs your honest answer in the comments right now. When you read Genesis 6, does the strange silence around what the sons of God actually did to those women ever disturb you? Or has the church always rushed past it too fast for you to ask? The Genesis Apocryphon preserves Lamech's words in fragments, but the fear is unmistakable. The child's appearance is described as extraordinary. His body carries something that does not look like the men around him. His eyes carry a light that unsettles his own father. And Lamech's mind goes immediately, not to joy, not to gratitude, but to the Watchers. He suspects that his wife Butnush conceived this child not with him, but with one of the beings that ancient Aramaic calls the Watchers, or with the Nephilim, the ones already walking the earth before this child was born. Read that again slowly. A father looks at his newborn son and wonders if that child belongs to a category of being that is not fully human. That is the world Genesis 6 describes. That is the world the flood is about to end. Butnush answers her husband directly. Her words in the Genesis Apocryphon are preserved as a forceful denial. She swears to him, she pleads with him, she reminds him that the pleasure of that night was his and hers alone. The child is Lamech. She is not lying. She is not hiding anything. But the fact that she has to say it, the fact that Lamech needs to hear it at all, tells the reader something about the world they are living in. Trust has already broken down. The boundary between heaven and earth has already been crossed, and the damage is not just physical. It is not just violence, not just the Nephilim walking among human settlements. The damage has reached the most private human space that exists, the bond between a husband and a wife in the moment their child is born. Lamech does not believe her. He sends word to his father Methuselah. He needs an elder, a witness, someone who can go further. Methuselah travels to find Enoch, and what Enoch tells them from the far edges of the earth, in the damaged but surviving lines of the Genesis Apocryphon, is the answer that saves Noah's identity. But not before the question nearly destroys his family. Here is what nobody in the Sunday school version of this story ever stops to ask. What kind of world produces a father who looks at his own son and genuinely cannot rule out angelic contamination? What had already happened on the earth? What lines had already been crossed? What had the Watchers already done? That a righteous man in a righteous family could stand over a newborn and feel that specific fear? That question does not have a simple answer. And the ancient texts that try to answer it were not included in the Bible most people carry. The earth is not peaceful before the flood. It is not merely wicked in the way of ordinary human failure, greed, and violence. Something has gone wrong at a deeper level. Something has crossed a line that was never supposed to be crossable, and the evidence is everywhere a person looks. Genesis 6 opens with a statement that has disturbed readers for 3,000 years. The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, and they took them as wives from all they chose. The Hebrew text uses the phrase Beni Ha Elohim, sons of God. The same phrase appears in Job 1 and Job 2, where it refers unmistakably to heavenly beings gathered before the divine throne. This is not a metaphor. This is not ancient poetry reaching for a comparison. This is a description of a category of being that Genesis treats as real and present on the earth. And then the Nephilim appear. Genesis sucks. Fudd does not explain the Nephilim carefully. It states them. It says they were on the earth in those days and also after that when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. The word Nephilim in Hebrew is connected by ancient interpreters to the root neph, meaning to fall. These are the fallen ones, or the ones who cause others to fall. The ancient text does not choose between those meanings. It lets both stand together. What follows in Genesis is the flood. The connection between these two events, the crossing of the sons of God and the judgment of the flood, is not incidental. The text places them side by side on purpose. The corruption that brings the flood is not only a human corruption, it is a cosmic one. The Book of 1 Enoch, preserved in full only in the Ethiopic biblical canon, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church includes it as sacred scripture to this day, expands what Genesis compresses into 4 verses. In 1 Enoch chapters 6 through 16, the watchers are named, numbered at 200, and their leader is identified as Shemahazah. They descend on Mount Haman. They take wives. They father children who are described as giants, 300 cubits in height in some manuscript traditions, consuming everything the earth produces, and then turning on each other and on humanity when the food runs out. This is where the stakes become something a modern reader cannot simply intellectualize. This is not a story about a local problem. This is not a regional drought or a corrupt king. The ancient interpreters of Genesis 6 understood the pre-flood world as a moment when the structural order of creation had been violated.
And you have all this population of people that survived after the flood situation happened. That's actually in the Bible, but nobody ever reads the Bible, so they would never actually know this. And if anybody is doubting what I says, just Google Nephilim survived the flood, and you get all the Bible verses right there. Right? The Bible verses are right there.
There is a word in the Hebrew text of Genesis sucks, none that matters enormously here. It describes Noah as tump, a word often translated as blameless or perfect. But in a world contaminated by watcher bloodlines, ancient readers understood tumpum to carry a second layer of meaning. It meant unblemished. It meant unmixed. It meant Noah's lineage had remained fully human when the lineage of those around him had not. That is the cosmic weight behind Lamach's fear. His son's appearance was so unusual that it triggered a question the surrounding world had already made believable. Watchers had crossed into human space. Their offspring walked among people. Births had already happened that produced beings outside the human category. Lamach's fear was not irrational. It was a reasonable response to a world where the boundary between heaven and earth had already been destroyed. The flood is not a punishment for ordinary sin. Read Genesis sucks, Fov through sucks 12 in sequence. The description of wickedness is extreme and layered. Every intention of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. All flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. The word corrupted here, in Hebrew shechet, means to destroy or to ruin completely, not to make morally imperfect but to render structurally broken. The watchers did not just commit sin. They unraveled something. They pulled a thread in the fabric of creation that caused the whole structure to come apart. And God looks down at the earth and sees it. And the grief in Genesis sucks. Sucks is not anger. The text says God was grieved in his heart, the same word used in Hebrew for human sorrow. Whatever the watchers began, it cost something even at the level of the divine. And now the only path forward runs through one man, one family, one child born in the middle of that ruined world, whose own father could not fully trust what he was looking at. Before that child's story can be understood, the sources that preserve it must be examined carefully. Because what survives in those ancient manuscripts is more layered, more disturbing, and more specific than anything printed in the 4 verses of Genesis 6. In 1947, A Bedouin shepherd boy threw a stone into a cave above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea and heard a clay jar shatter. What came out of that cave over the next several years changed the academic study of the Bible permanently. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found across 11 caves at Qumran between 1947 and 1956, contained approximately 900 manuscripts. The oldest date to the 3rd century BCE. They include the oldest known copies of nearly every book in the Hebrew Bible. They also include texts that never made it into the canon: the Community Rule, the War Scroll, the Temple Scroll, the Book of Giants, and the Genesis Apocryphon. These are not fringe discoveries. They are housed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, in the Shrine of the Book, and studied by scholars from every major research university in the world. The Genesis Apocryphon, cataloged as 1 Cap Gen, is written in Aramaic. It retells and expands Genesis from Lamech's perspective, and it is the primary surviving text that describes Lamech's crisis over Noah's birth in the detail this story requires. Scholars, including Joseph Fitzmyer, who produced the standard critical edition of the text, confirm that the passage describing Lamech's fear and Beit-Nosh's response is genuine ancient material, not a medieval edition, not a forgery. The Book of 1 Enoch is the second pillar. It is not a minor curiosity. The New Testament letter of Jude, chapter 1 verse 14, quotes 1 Enoch directly, identifying Enoch as the 7th from Adam and citing his prophecy about the Lord coming with 10,000s of his holy ones. This quotation appears in the canonical New Testament. The author of Jude knew 1 Enoch and treated it as authoritative. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 references angels who sinned and were cast into chains in darkness, a clear parallel to the Watcher tradition preserved in 1 Enoch. The New Testament does not ignore the Watcher story. It assumes the reader already knows it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, tracing its origins to the 1st century, has always included 1 Enoch in its biblical canon. The Ge'ez version of 1 Enoch, preserved in Ethiopia for centuries, is the only complete version of the text that exists. Without the Ethiopian canon, significant portions of 1 Enoch would be known only in fragments. The Book of Giants, another Qumran text, expands on the offspring of the Watchers and their violence before the flood. Fragments of it appear in multiple Qumran caves. A parallel version of the same tradition appears in the Manichaean corpus, an entirely separate ancient religious tradition. Two different ancient traditions, geographically and theologically separated, preserving overlapping accounts of the same pre-flood figures. That convergence is not coincidence. That is the kind of multi-source corroboration that historians use as a signal that a tradition is preserving something genuinely ancient. The linguistic evidence adds another layer. The Hebrew word Nephilim in Genesis 6:4 resists simple translation. In the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible produced in Alexandria in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, Nephilim is rendered as giants. Numbers 13:33, in the report of the Israelite spies returning from Canaan, uses Nephilim again to describe the inhabitants they encountered, and adds that the spies felt like grasshoppers in comparison. This is the canonical Hebrew Bible, not a secondary text, describing descendants of the same lineage appearing 4 centuries after the flood. The Aramaic term used in the Genesis Apocryphon for the beings Lamech fears is Iran, the Watchers. The same term appears in the canonical book of Daniel chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar's dream includes Iran, holy Watchers, as messengers from the divine realm. The Watcher language is not invented by Enochic literature. It is present in a canonical biblical book accepted by every major tradition. These sources do not all agree on every detail. Scholars note variations, damaged sections, theological layering from different periods. That honest complexity is part of what makes them credible.
Writings, which literally means false writing. And so think of it today, when we want to plagiarize today, we'll put our name on someone else's writing so that it can have more credibility and authority and validity. In this day, they would put someone else's name who had credibility and authority on their writing.
Fabricated texts tend toward perfect consistency. Ancient texts carry the marks of real transmission across real time. What they agree on is the core. The pre-flood world saw a transgression by heavenly beings. The consequences shaped the earth in catastrophic ways, and a child named Noah was born in the middle of it, surrounded by a family trying to determine what was still human and what was not. The evidence for all of this sits in real museums, cited in peer-reviewed journals, and debated in university classrooms. And still, most people have never heard Lamech's name. Lamech does not wait. He goes directly to his wife and demands the truth out loud. The Genesis Apocryphon preserves this confrontation in Aramaic fragments, and even through the damage and the gaps, the emotional charge is unmistakable. Lamech is not asking gently. The text captures a man in genuine distress, speaking to the woman he married in the room where she just gave birth, demanding to know whether the child in front of him belongs to a watcher or to the Nephilim. Beit-Nosh does not answer quietly. Her response in the surviving text is forceful and specific. She calls on the holy and great God. She swears by the divine name. She tells Lamech that the pleasure and the warmth came from him, not from a stranger, not from any heavenly being, not from any of the watchers who walk among the sons of heaven. The child is his. She is not uncertain. She is not evasive. She swears. But Lamech cannot rest there. This is the detail that cuts the deepest in the entire story. Beit-Nosh's answer is direct and sworn before God. In any ordinary situation, that would be enough. A wife swears to her husband by the name of the holy God. The matter is settled, but Lamech still sends word to his father Methuselah. He needs more than her word. He needs a witness who stands outside the situation. Methuselah, the oldest man in the biblical genealogy, lives long enough in the Genesis chronology to have walked alongside Enoch before Enoch was taken by God. When Lamech's fear reaches him, Methuselah travels to find Enoch. In the Genesis Apocryphon's preserved sections, Enoch is described as being at the ends of the earth, separated from the living, dwelling in a space between the human and the divine. What Enoch tells Methuselah to carry back to Lamech is the confirmation that Noah is genuinely Lamech's son, and that the extraordinary appearance of the child has a different meaning entirely. The child is set apart not because he carries watcher blood, but because he will be needed. The flood is coming. The world's corruption has already reached its limit. And this child, this frightening, luminous child whose own father doubted him, is the one through whom the human line will survive. The reversal is striking. Everything that made Lamech afraid, the child's unusual appearance, the light, the features that did not match the world around him, is not evidence of contamination. It is evidence of calling. But look at what this moment reveals about the world those characters are living in. A righteous man doubts his righteous wife. A grandmother must travel to the edge of the known world to find an answer. And the answer has to come from a prophet who has already been removed from ordinary human life, because the ordinary human world has become unsafe. The Watchers did not only damage the earth physically, they damaged the ability of human beings to trust what they were looking at. They introduced a contamination so deep that even love, even marriage, even the birth of a child became uncertain ground. In 1 Enoch chapter 10, the archangel Raphael is commanded to bind the Watcher leader Azazel hand and foot, to throw him into the darkness, to cover him with rough and jagged rocks, because the earth has been corrupted by his teaching. The text specifies what Azazel taught: the making of swords, shields, and breastplates, the revealing of metals from the earth, and the knowledge of how to make ornaments and cosmetics that led men to lust and women to corruption. The violence that filled the pre-flood world did not come from human nature alone. It was taught. It was spread deliberately. Numbers 13, 33 places Nephilim still in the land of Canaan after the flood, in a report given by Israelite spies to Moses. The descendants of Anak, giants by the spies' own description, are identified directly as being from the Nephilim. The canon does not treat the Nephilim as a finished chapter at the flood. It treats them as a recurring problem with roots going back to Genesis 6. Lamech did not imagine the threat. The threat was real. The world that produced his fear was real. And the child he almost could not claim, as his own grows up to build the ark. But here is the question the Genesis Apocryphon raises that the canonical text never directly answers. If Enoch had to be consulted at the ends of the earth to confirm Noah's humanity, how many other births in that generation did not receive that confirmation? How many children were born in the pre-flood world whose fathers asked the same question and received no answer? 3 ancient texts, 1 child, 1 father too terrified to trust what he was holding. And now the story pulls back, and the view from above is worse than anything seen from inside Lamech's house. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not surface quietly. They were fought over, delayed, restricted from publication for decades. The full scroll access that scholars have today did not come without a long institutional struggle. Some of the most significant Enochic fragments from Qumran were not published until the 1970s and 1980s. The Genesis Apocryphon itself, one of the original 7 major scrolls, was in such fragile condition that years passed before scholars could unroll and read its inner columns. The question is not whether the texts existed. They sat in the ground for 2,000 years. The question is what some institutions chose to do with the silence around them once they were found. Hi viewers, drop a comment right now and answer this honestly. Did you ever hear Lamech's name mentioned in a church sermon, a Bible study, or a Sunday school class? Yes or no? The Genesis Apocryphon names Beit-Nosh. It records her sworn denial. It records Lamech's fear by name. It preserves Methuselah's role as a messenger and Enoch's role as the final confirmation. These are named figures in a named ancient text, housed in a named museum, studied by named scholars in peer-reviewed publications. None of this is hidden in the sense of being destroyed or erased. But the gap between what is academically documented and what reaches ordinary believers on a Sunday morning is wide enough to ask hard questions about.
Here are the assumptions that it depicts. He says, these are things he says. It depicts a first century Hebrew male. That it depicts an individual who is scourged and crucified. That it depicts an individual who had worn a crown of thorns. That the individual's hairstyle is from the first century, and that it was a Hebrew hairstyle.
The Council of Laodicea in 363 CE produced a canon list that excluded one Enoch. The reasons given by early church councils for excluding Enochic literature varied, but one concern that appears in patristic writing is the theological complexity introduced by the Watcher tradition. If angelic beings could cross into human space and produce offspring, the implications for categories like sin, judgment, and redemption became difficult to manage within developing creedal frameworks. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never accepted those exclusions. One Enoch remained scripture. The Book of Jubilees remained scripture. The Watchers and the Nephilim remained part of the biblical narrative that Ethiopian Christians carried into liturgy and teaching. 2 ancient Christian traditions, same basic source material, dramatically different decisions about what the people in the pews would be allowed to read. The text survived. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived 2,000 years in desert caves because the air was dry and the jars were sealed. The Ge'ez manuscripts of 1 Enoch survived in Ethiopian monasteries because monks copied them century after century, treating them as sacred. Something wanted these words to be found. And now, a man named Lamech is standing in a room with his newborn son, and a world that has been watching this story from the outside is about to learn that the texts describing what he feared were not destroyed. They were only waiting. What those texts say next about the Watchers, about the knowledge they spread, about the institutions that tried to contain the damage, goes further than anything covered in the first part of this story. Much further. The scrolls were not supposed to survive. 2,000 years in a desert cave, sealed in clay jars, wrapped in linen, hidden in the cliffs above the Dead Sea. The men who placed them there were not careless. They were desperate. They were preserving something they believed the world was about to lose, and they were right about the danger because the Roman army destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE and the community at Qumran with it. But the caves held. The dry Judean air held. And what came out of those caves in 1947 included traditions about the Watchers and the Nephilim that certain institutions had spent centuries keeping away from ordinary believers. Here is where the story turns from ancient to structural. The Council of Laodicea in 363 CE produced a list of acceptable scriptures. First Enoch was not on it. The Book of Jubilees was not on it. The Book of Giants was not on it. These exclusions were not random. Patristic writers including Origen and Tertullian had engaged seriously with Enochic tradition in earlier centuries. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd and 3rd century CE, explicitly defended the authority of one Enoch, arguing that it had been preserved by Noah himself. Then the canon discussions sharpened. The institutional church began drawing harder lines, and the Watcher tradition, with its angels crossing into human space and its offspring walking the earth, became theologically inconvenient for a developing creedal framework that needed clean categories. Clean categories require clean silences. But the silences did not hold everywhere. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, whose Christian roots trace to the 4th century CE through the conversion of King Ezana of Aksum, never accepted the exclusions made at Laodicea or at later Western councils. The Ethiopian biblical canon contains 81 books. The Protestant canon contains 66. The difference is not a minor editorial disagreement. Books like 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Enoch's expanded Watcher traditions remained fully embedded in Ethiopian Christian worship, liturgy, and theological education for over 1,600 years without interruption. Those Ethiopian monks copied 1 Enoch by hand, century after century, because they considered it the Word of God. Without them, the complete text would not exist. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain Aramaic fragments of 1 Enoch across multiple caves, confirming the text's existence before the Common Era. But the only complete version of 1 Enoch that researchers can read from beginning to end today exists because of the Ethiopian Church's faithfulness. That is not a footnote. That is a structural fact about who decided what believers were allowed to know and who refused to accept those decisions. Now look at what 1 Enoch chapters 7 and 8 actually say the Watchers taught. Not vague wickedness, specific knowledge. Azazel taught men to make swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. He taught the cutting of roots and the use of metals drawn from the earth. He showed women how to make ornaments of gold and silver, how to use precious stones, how to apply eye paint and beautify themselves in ways that led to lust and disorder. Shemiheza and the other Watchers taught enchantments, root cuttings, astrology, the movement of the moon, and the signs of the earth. 1 Enoch chapter 8 verse 2 names these transmissions explicitly. This is not metaphor. Ancient interpreters used this tradition to explain the specific texture of pre-flood violence. It was not chaotic. It was organized. It was armed. It was fueled by knowledge that humanity had not developed on its own and was not equipped to use responsibly. The Watchers did not tempt human beings toward ordinary sin. They handed weapons to a species that had no moral framework built to contain them. The result is described in 1 Enoch chapter 9, where the archangels Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel look down at the earth and see the blood that is being shed, the lawlessness, the crying of human souls ascending to the gates of heaven. They bring the situation before God directly. The text captures them saying that the earth has become filled with unrighteousness through the teachings of Azazel, and that every secret thing is being done and taught on earth that should not be done. Every secret thing. That phrase carries an enormous weight when placed beside the pre-flood world that produced Lamech's fear. The knowledge the Watchers spread was not neutral information misused by weak humans. It was precisely the kind of knowledge designed to break boundaries. It destabilized the earth. It destabilized families. It destabilized the ability of human beings to look at each other and know what they were seeing. Lamech looked at his son and could not trust his own eyes. That is what forbidden knowledge spread by powerful beings produces in the world it enters. Not just external violence, internal collapse, the destruction of the capacity to trust what is real. And here is the weight that lands hardest. The texts describing all of this survived. They were copied. They were hidden. They were found again. The Dead Sea Scrolls were not published in full to the academic community until 1991, over 40 years after their discovery, following a prolonged institutional struggle that scholars like Jezza Vermes publicly criticized as unjustified delay. The question is not whether the information was destroyed. It clearly was not. The question is how long certain institutions were comfortable letting it sit unread while ordinary believers were handed 4 verses of Genesis 6 and told that was the whole story. 4 verses for a cosmic event that ancient interpreters spent centuries trying to describe. Right now, in the 21st century, the same pattern Genesis 6 describes is being named openly. Matthew 24:37. Jesus speaking to his disciples on the Mount of Olives, answering their question about the sign of his coming and the end of the age. His answer is direct. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. He does not elaborate. He does not explain what made the days of Noah different from other wicked periods in history. He assumes the people listening already know. He assumes that when someone says the days of Noah, the room understands the full weight of what that phrase carries. For a first-century Jewish audience, the days of Noah did not mean ordinary moral failure. It meant the Watcher event. It meant the Nephilim. It meant the breakdown of the boundary between heaven and earth, between human and something else, between knowledge given by God and knowledge seized without permission. Any first-century Jewish listener who had access to 1 Enoch and the Dead Sea Scrolls confirm that Enochic texts were widely circulated in Second Temple Judaism would have heard Matthew 24:37 as a specific warning, not a general one. This is not an argument about end times theology. This is a documented historical and linguistic fact about what the phrase days of Noah meant to the people who first heard Jesus say it. And now the question comes directly to the person watching this. The world right now carries a specific kind of knowledge problem, not a shortage of information, but a flood of it, moving faster than any human moral framework can process, generated by systems that most people cannot fully understand, carrying consequences that nobody fully predicted. The ancient world feared heavenly secrets misused on earth. The modern world is living inside a version of that problem at a scale the ancient world could not have imagined. That parallel is not decoration. It is the structural reason Matthew 24:37 still hits with force. It is why Jesus did not say the days of Moses or the days of David. He chose the one moment in recorded history where the contamination was not political, not military, not merely moral, but ontological. It reached into what human beings were at the level of their nature and their origin.
The serpent versus the seed of Eve, and that's basically the seed of the serpent trying to stop Messiah. And it was a way to make sense of the giants that were all throughout the Bible, as well as these spiritual things. And
Jude chapter 1 verse 6 states plainly that angels who did not stay within their own domain, but abandoned their proper dwelling, are being kept in eternal chains under darkness until the judgment of the great day. 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 says God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into darkness, delivering them to chains to be held until judgment. Both passages are canonical. Both are in every Bible on every shelf in every home in the United States right now. Neither one is explained to most congregations with the Enochic background that makes them fully legible. Without that background, Jude 6 reads like a vague reference to a rebellion nobody can identify. With that background, it reads like a legal verdict handed down after a specific, named, documented catastrophe. The difference between those two readings is the difference between a church that manages the mystery and a believer who is finally allowed to face it. Now bring it closer, not as history, as a question for the present. If the days of Noah describe a moment when knowledge was given to humanity before humanity had the moral formation to use it without destroying itself, then every age has to ask, what knowledge is circulating right now that falls into that category? What has been handed to humanity by forces that do not share the consequences? What is being taught, normalized, and spread that is producing the same downstream result the watchers produced in a pre-flood world? Violence organized and systematic, trust collapsing, the categories of human identity becoming unstable. Those questions are not answered here. They are placed in front of the viewer on purpose, because the ancient texts do not give comfortable conclusions. They give uncomfortable clarity, and then they ask the reader what to do with it. Noah was born into a world that had already passed a point of no return. He did not choose the world he arrived in. He did not create the corruption around him. What defined him was not his circumstances but his character, that Hebrew word tamim, unblemished, whole, unmixed, a man whose inner structure had not been invaded by the disorder that surrounded him. That description is not irrelevant to the present moment. It is a direct instruction. Noah never asked to be extraordinary. That is the detail the text preserves, and most readers walk past without stopping. The canonical Genesis introduces Noah in chapter 5 verse 29 with a nomming that carries hope. His father Lamech says this one will bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands caused by the ground that the Lord has cursed. The name Noah in Hebrew is connected to the word for comfort, Nachem. This is a father nomming his son with grief and expectation folded together. A father who has lived in a broken world long enough to need a reason to hope. And then comes the Genesis Apocryphan's account of that same birth, the comfort and the terror arriving in the same moment, the same child, the same hands, the same father. The theological weight of that contrast is enormous. A man who carries enough faith to name his child Comfort is also a man so undone by the world around him that he cannot trust what his own eyes are seeing. That is not a contradiction. That is an honest portrait of what it means to live in a generation where the moral and spiritual contamination has gone deep enough to reach private life, family life, the bedroom and the crib, the first moments of a new human being's existence. This is the theological payload the grieving believer tradition carries. The grief is not about doubt. It is about the cost of living in a corrupted world while trying to remain uncorrupted inside it. Every generation of believers who has read Genesis 6 slowly has felt that cost. The world presses in. The categories blur. Even the righteous man in a righteous family has to send his father to the end of the earth to confirm that his child is still human. The cosmic war framework that 1 Enoch builds around the pre-flood period is not mythology in the dismissive sense. It is a theological description of a real conflict with a specific target. The Watcher transgression was not random. The offspring it produced, the knowledge it spread, the violence it organized, all of it moved in a direction that threatened the one thing the flood narrative ultimately protects: the survival of the human line through which the rest of the biblical story moves. Take that away and nothing downstream makes sense. No Abraham, no Moses, no David, no Bethlehem. Noah is not a hero in the traditional sense. He does not fight. He does not prophesy to the nations. He builds, he gathers, he waits. And when the water comes, he survives, not because of power, not because of supernatural origin, but because he remained whole in a world that was systematically destroying wholeness. Here is the self-examination the text demands. The Genesis Apocryphon does not preserve Lamech's fear as a failure. It preserves it as evidence of what righteousness costs when the surrounding world has made even trust a casualty of its corruption. Lamech's doubt was not a sin. It was a wound, and the wound was inflicted not by his wife, not by his son, but by a world that the Watchers had broken. The ancient readers who copied and preserved and hid and recopied these texts understood something that a sanitized Sunday morning version of the flood story cannot fully convey. The flood is not primarily about water. It is about what the water was answering. And what it was answering was a world so thoroughly invaded by disorder that even the birth of the man who would save humanity could not be recognized for what it was without divine confirmation from the edge of the earth. Enoch's answer to Lamech, carried by Methuselah across whatever distance separated them, is more than a paternity confirmation. It is a declaration that the divine purpose embedded in one human life is not erased by the chaos surrounding that life. Noah is not extraordinary because he escaped corruption. He is extraordinary because corruption surrounded him completely and did not get inside.
Darkness, all the foundations of the earth are shaken. So there's this idea that these gods were somehow given some responsibility by God to rule over humanity in some way. Now, we find out more about that when we read Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 through 9, where
that is the hardest kind of righteousness to maintain, and the ancient world knew it. The text does not end with Enoch's confirmation as a resolution. It ends with an implication. If the world was that far gone, if even a prophet at the edge of the earth was needed to confirm what a father could not see in his own child, then the flood was not a punishment sent from the outside in. It was the only possible answer to a world that had destroyed itself from the inside out. And the child who was almost not claimed became the man who carried every human being who came after him. The viewer who has stayed this far is not a casual bystander. That is a statement worth sitting with. Most people who encounter the title of this documentary make a quick decision in the first 45 seconds. They stay or they leave. The ones who are still here at this point have done something specific. They have allowed the weight of an ancient question to stay with them long enough to feel what it actually costs. That is not a small thing in a world built to produce distraction. Think back to the first words of this story. A man standing over a newborn child, shaking, not from weakness but from the specific terror of a world that had broken enough things that even a father's recognition of his own son required confirmation from the edge of the earth. That was the opening image. Hold it now, because it is not just history. Every generation has its version of Lamech's question. What is real? What has been contaminated? What can still be trusted? What has to be sent to the furthest possible witness before a person can believe it? The days of Noah are not a past event sealed inside a Bronze Age text. Jesus named them as a future pattern, a recurring shape, a description of the kind of world that appears before a certain kind of accounting arrives. And the shape he described is not primarily about violence or flood water. It is about the breakdown of the categories that hold human life together, the categories of truth and origin, and what a person actually is at their core. The person watching this right now is living in a moment when those categories are under a specific kind of pressure that the ancient world would have recognized immediately. Not because ancient people were the same as modern people, but because the structure of the problem does not change when the technology does. Knowledge spreading faster than moral formation, power operating without accountability, beings and systems with access to human intimate life that were never invited in. The texture is different. The shape is identical. Noah did not survive because he was immune to the world around him. He survived because he did not allow what was outside to redefine what was inside. The Hebrew word tamim, unblemished, did not describe a man who had never been exposed to corruption. In a pre-flood world, exposure was unavoidable. It described a man whose inner structure, his lineage, his covenant, his moral formation, remained intact under pressure that had broken everything else. That is the personal challenge the ancient text places on the table, not a call to isolation, not a call to pretend the world is simpler than it is, a call to identify what inside a person is genuinely tamim, genuinely whole, genuinely unmixed, and to hold it with both hands while the flood of information and noise and moral confusion rises around them. Lamech needed Enoch's voice to recognize his own son. This documentary is not Enoch, but the texts it draws from, the Genesis Apocryphon, 1st Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Ethiopian Biblical Canon, the canonical passages of Jude and 2 Peter. Those texts are as close to that ancient voice as anything available to a modern reader. They survived 2,000 years of desert and institutional silence and deliberate restriction, and a 40-year publication delay. They are here now. The open question that this entire story leaves standing is not about the watchers. It is not even about Noah. It is about what a person does when the confirmation finally arrives. Lamech received the word from Enoch and claimed his son. He stopped doubting. He moved forward. The question the ancient text leaves for every reader who takes it seriously is this: what truth have you been standing over, shaking, unable to claim, waiting for a confirmation that may have already arrived in the words of texts most people have never been given permission to read? That question does not have a tidy answer. It was not designed to. It was designed to stay with the person who hears it. It was designed to produce the kind of reflection that changes how a person reads the next 4 verses of Genesis 6, and the next sermon, and the next silence where a hard question should have been asked and was not. This is not the end of the story. This is the entrance to it. The documentary you just watched draws on real manuscripts in real museums, cited by real scholars in real peer-reviewed publications. The Genesis Apocryphon is in the shrine of the book in Jerusalem. 1st Enoch is in the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and has been for 1,600 years. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the most studied ancient manuscript discovery in history. Every source named in this documentary can be found, read, and verified by any person with access to a library or a university database. That is not an accident. That is the result of people across centuries, in caves and monasteries and desert communities, making a decision that these words mattered enough to preserve at any cost. A Bedouin boy threw a stone into a cave, and the jars broke and the scrolls came out. The Ethiopian monks kept copying through every century of silence. The scholars who fought for full Dead Sea Scrolls access pushed until the material was released. The chain of transmission held. And now the story of a man who could not recognize his own son, in a world so broken that trust itself had become a casualty, is reaching a viewer in the 21st century through a screen. If that does not feel like something more than coincidence, it is worth sitting with that feeling. The next documentary on this channel goes further. There is an ancient tablet tradition preserved in both Mesopotamian sources and Second Temple Jewish texts that describes what the pre-flood world actually looked like from the inside, not from above at the moment of judgment, but from ground level, from the perspective of the people living in it before the water came. What those traditions describe about the cities, the knowledge systems, the social structures, and the beings walking openly among humans in that period raises questions about Genesis 1 through 6 that most Bible commentaries do not touch. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so that documentary reaches you the moment it is released. Not because of platform numbers, because the kind of questions this content raises deserve a community of people willing to sit with them honestly, push back on comfortable answers, and keep asking until the picture comes into focus. The comments section below this video is not a place for quick reactions. It is a place to share what landed hardest, what challenged a belief you have held for years, What questioned this documentary opened that you have never had words for before. Those comments matter. They show other people who are wrestling with the same questions that they are not alone in asking them. One honest comment can give another viewer the courage to stay with a question instead of walking away from it. Lamech almost walked away from his own son. Enoch's voice brought him back. These ancient texts, dusty and damaged and long delayed, are still carrying voices like that for anyone willing to listen. The next video is already waiting. Do not miss it.